There are only so many permutations of things two humans can do to each other, are there? Or maybe not. But it's also really easy because it's sex and everybody likes to talk about it.
Hi, I'm Raihan Salam. Today, Vice meets Maureen O'Connor, a columnist at New York Magazine and The Cut. Maureen, thanks very much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Maureen, you write about an absolutely dizzying array of subjects, from stuffing one's bra to licking people's butts and many other things in the universe of sex, relationships, self-presentation, and with a particular focus, I guess, on young adults.
Well, I've been writing for a while. I've been editing and writing at The Cut for a while. I guess just my natural topics of interest, whatever I happen to be talking about with my friends. But when we started the sex column at the magazine, they hadn't had one in a while, and that actually came from my bosses. I'd had a breakup pretty recently, and then I came into their office and they're like, so we're gonna have a sex column and we think you're gonna do it. And I was like, wow, that's so not what I want to think about right now. This is going to ruin my love life.
So the genre of the sex column has been around for a very long time, but writing it in the mid 2010s, what are the different things that are on people's minds? Because I mean, to some degree, I guess you're responding to what's in the ether. What do people care about? What are they thinking about? What are the conversations people are having? So what are those things that keep recurring?
Sex is simultaneously, I think, the hardest and easiest topic to write about. It's hard in that there's nothing new in some ways, that you're there are only so many permutations of things two humans can do to each other, are there? Or maybe not. But it's also really easy because it's sex and everybody likes to talk about it. I mean, the way we deal with sex in terms of the way we communicate is perpetually changing, obviously, today. And so that changes all romantic and sexual relationships too, because it's communication. But other than that, it's just whatever behavioral practices people are down with and doing.
One of the things that you are unusually good at writing about is the way that new technological tools have changed how people meet and mate and what have you. So my understanding is that computer dating is a very old phenomenon. I mean, that's been around for decades. You had very primitive computer dating in the 70s, I believe. But then obviously the internet changes things. Then you had, kind of whatever. You have Usenet boards, and you have people meeting creepy strangers on the internet and claiming to be women, perhaps. But then, obviously, kind of once you're able to share, so it's kind of evolved quite a lot. But you mentioned Match.com. So, there is this time when people have profiles, and then other people find your profiles, et cetera. But now it works pretty differently, doesn't it?
Well, I think that sort of in the beginning of online dating, at least, if we put it sort of in that genre, the problem was just getting people on the internet. Just the idea of making a profile, which is such an inherently humiliating
because what
exercise,
if someone finds you?
That all of a sudden we're creating these infinite self-portraits of ourselves, which is such a weird process. So everybody, they made these sort of lengthy profiles and all that. And then as people kept using it, everyone realized that you sort of don't need to write this long profile, because first of all, everyone's already on the internet. They're already now on Facebook or whatever else. And on top of that, nobody even reads the profiles, as I believe OkCupid just did a blog post about that.
Oh, good God.
Their studies of what they did when they were looking at, they used to have people rate how many stars you think this person's looks and personality have. Yeah. And they realized that it was a perfect correlation, that everybody who was beautiful had a good personality and everybody who was ugly had a bad personality, according to the ratings.
This reminds me of just the larger conversation about disruptive technologies. So in a way, I mean, the traditional online dating sites with a lengthy profile, in a way, that was just a lot to go through and a lot of stuff that people were ignoring.
Right.
Whereas, some of the new things, your Tinders, your Hinges, et cetera, these are more lightweight, I guess. Mm-hmm. And so they're easier for people to kind of process and sort of that kind of thing?
No, I think it's, on one hand, so I finally got around to joining OkCupid, which for a very long time I'd just been forcing my friends to let me log into yours every time I needed to look at it for some reason, if I was writing about it or whatever. And they all got kind of sick of that. So I finally made my own one. And the thing was, I just realized that I was I can't message anyone because, oh God, I have to set aside time to read his profile so that I don't, I don't accidentally ask a question that was something that I should already know. Yeah. And it felt like homework, and I was just ugh, I can't deal with it.
Yeah, that is interesting. It does create this weird pressure because there is this expectation that there's this reading material that you ought to process in some way. So when you're talking about in the early days of online dating, to some degree, the internet was still a space for creeps and weirdos, and also the vulnerability or the kind of apparent, let's say, desperation of someone putting oneself on display in that way. And so maybe the profile itself was a way of kind of like making it seem kosher. Do you think that's part of what was going on?
I mean, every time that you have sort of a mechanized way of trying to get people to meet, if you're using like a matchmaker, if you're doing like speed dating or singles mix, basically every form of dating that is sort of mechanical and is a like systematic way to get you to meet people outside your social circle, I feel like those usually are just really biographical, just like on their own, because you're meeting somebody you have no context with.
Right.
So that sort of makes sense. If anything, it's weirder to meet, well, not weirder, but the idea that you'd be sort of like doing like a systematic strike on a bunch of strangers without a lot of information is in some ways kind of counterintuitive.
So
on the other hand,
what you just described is going to a bar.
And Tinder.
Right. Okay.
Which are actually the same, that's like the way I think of it. That it's the equivalent of like you get to go to the bar, but if you went to the bar and you saw 50 people, you knew every single one of them was single.
Yeah.
Like it's just so much more
and it
efficient.
certainly, and it saves an enormous amount of time because like a lot of it is this kind of like awkward processing of like kind of what is someone's deal. It's interesting because when you think about like the wedding ring, I mean the purpose of a wedding ring is to some degree to kind of like save time. Whereas like I think that when people are in, if marriage is not as central an institution, or if people delay marriage or whatever else, there are all of these different gradations.
Right.
So it's almost like if everyone wore like different rings of different colors expressing how committed they were or how open to mingling they are.
You described a key party maybe? Is that what you just described?
Well, I mean, but it is interesting because it's kind of the idea of like, what are these kind of like easy signals that one could use? So I guess like in a way, Tinder is like that. It's binary. Like I'm either into it or not, at least theoretically. Mm-hmm. So I mean, when you talk about like mechanics and like kind of the mechanics of like meeting people and what have you. So what I wonder about is when you're living in a big city, you're automatically way more open to like large numbers of people. Mm-hmm. And these technologies, do you feel like kind of what they're doing is like recreating the conditions of being in a big city?
God, that's so funny. I was just talking about this with one of my friends that she was saying, she's like, I think it's really hard to settle down in New York because every single day I ride the subway and it's like, I just see like 1,000 faces every single day. And you're just so sort of aware of like, there are other options. Are you sure you've got the best one? Which is to some degree, I think, what online dating does in that you have this sort of this sense of this infinitely renewable supply of potential mates. Mm. But I personally, I think a lot of people see that as a downside, that they're like, oh, how will you ever choose one? You're just like, tempted to be a slut.
What makes everything contingent?
I happen to think it's great because if anything, that I think anytime that like you're just not trapped. There's so many people in this world. There's so many people you haven't met yet.
Yeah.
The world is full of people. And it's easy not to see people because if you live your life and you sort of see the same people sort of on this regular scheduled what you do, like being on Tinder, the number of people I've met that live like a block away from me, and I was like, what? You go to all different bars than I do. Yeah. Everything is different.
Yeah, being like
you live right there.
Being right next to someone and leading a totally parallel life and having some insight into that. I mean, to me, it reflects a lot of larger economic and social questions. Because like when you think about like, okay, there's some people who are just instinctively terrified of, and for good reason, of like new disruptive things. Like, okay, like Uber, is gonna like destroy everyone's livelihood, or like whatever, Airbnb is gonna, like just kind of these new things that kind of create this cornucopia, potentially create this kind of volume, but also it's going to kind of change settled arrangements to some degree. Do you feel like you kind of are eager to like embrace change and the kind of chaos of like, would you say your attitude is pretty common among your peers, the people that you talk to most?
I don't know, it's hard to measure because I'm also not, doing any like systematic surveying of say like my generation or, among say like my friends or the people I'm like, closest with that come up a lot in the columns, as one of my friends was like, it's like reading blind items about all of our friends. Who is the person that like butt licking that much? I would say that I'm probably one of the more like, yeah, give it a try type people. I feel like I had to cut back on like the quantity of first dates I was doing only because I was like, I'm wasting all my time on strangers.
But what also is like a way to research.
But it's fun.
Well, it's also a way to like kind of research the column, I imagine, because you're like, kind of the first date context is a way that you kind of figure out at least a little bit. People, or maybe at least in New York culture, people are disclosing all of their hang-ups and the way they've been like damaged by their parents or whatever else. So like in a weird way, don't you feel like you learn a tremendous amount?
Oh yeah, no. Well, the funny thing is that I thought writing about dating and sex was going to ruin my love life in my like becoming single again phase. And in fact, what it does is it makes it so that every single date is a successful date because like if I'm not interested in the person, I'm basically doing a quasi interview because you're just sitting there asking like, so how often do you date? What do you do when you date? And the other thing is it's like one of the few socially acceptable times you can ask absolutely anything of someone. Which
Yeah.
just the level of sort of like bizarre honesty that you're able to have with a complete stranger is really fun.
It is.
I don't know why everyone doesn't go on a million first dates.
It is extremely interesting because there is something about the premise of a date that creates intimacy, call it false intimacy or whatever else. But it is, and I kind of wonder why that would be true, because you would think that actually you're making yourself vulnerable, but like it's almost like the strategic vulnerability. Yeah, I don't know, but it just seems weird because you would think that actually people would be a bit more postury or like a bit more.
I think people are also like bigger dicks when they're on dates because on some level you're like, if I don't like this person, just like cut them off, forget it, it's gone forever, you know?
Right. Yeah, and also you're not sort of connected to them.
Sometimes you share some social context, but sort of that you like it's. Especially if it's like, say, a date you found online or, you know, just somebody that you have very little...
Well, again, who's outside of your social circle, potentially.
You just cut it off as soon as you're done.
So, okay. So you think that this is really a positive development and, you know, you think that it would be, it's generally, not for everyone, but generally a good and healthy thing for people to open themselves to these experiences?
I don't know. I don't think I usually think in terms of what's healthy and what isn't. I think I just sort of... I just look at what is. I think that's... I don't see anything as being that many things as being inherently healthy or unhealthy. Although it's certainly true that certain things can be positive or negative for certain people. Like if you have like crippling social anxiety, don't go on a million first dates.
And also maybe it's about how you manage to integrate a certain practice into your life. Because it's all going to depend on the person, but it's also like what are the things that you learn how to do to kind of make this a healthy thing for you or not. There's another dimension when we're thinking about, kind of how the kind of sexual marketplace has changed. So, we've talked about this contingency that happens, the kind of the idea of like many, many options out in the world. But there's also something just about sex practices for this generation, because when you think about millennials, these are people who grew up, kind of when they were quite young, being exposed to AIDS and kind of the idea of sex being associated with danger. And there was also a belief among many, certainly 10 years ago or so, that this was a generation that was going to be a little more traditionally minded or a bit more kind of risk averse and cautious about sex as a result, and maybe a bit more like monogamous. But it seems as though at least you're uncovering a world that's not like that. Like, I'm wondering about like that, do you feel like this is a generation that finds sex dangerous and threatening?
Probably both. I don't know about whether in terms of if a generation finds it more or less threatening than other generations. I think even the way we talk about stuff like group sex right now, even, it gets put through this sort of Dan Savage-y monogamish filter. And in some ways, even people going to get three-ways get sort of presented as a sort of way of exalting or enhancing this like pair bond, right? This is like something you do together or something you agree to do separately, but it's like something that is it's not like a sort of like wild key party swinging type situation. It's more of a like, this is something special that a couple does. And in some ways, I actually think that is a very traditional way of looking at relationships, because it's still a sort of like reification of the initial pair that is bonded together and works together and sticks together. Yeah, even if it's not literally monogamous.
I think the idea that I find interesting is the idea of relationships as work, and like and a specific kind of relationship work, because I think that kind of for most of human history, and I'm making a glib generalization, but kind of it was an alliance of families. It was complementary. It was a kind of production partnership, and like you have these roles, I have these, sort of, et cetera. To this idea of the relationship as a thing in itself that merits care and attention, and to me, it's almost just like a reflection on, I don't know, when I think about like achievers, and like just kind of achievers are working on everything, and this is like a thing you work on, but then like why? Like, I mean, anyway, that's sort of a...
No, it is because your relationship is like very much freely chosen. You don't have to marry if you don't ever want to, or we're talking about a kind of specific set of people in America, but I guess that's the idea of, that's where it's changing, is that you don't have to do any of these things. You could theoretically, in certain like open-minded circles, you could marry anyone. Your parents aren't going to stop you. There's never going to be, that's unsuitable and that person can't be part of our family.
Yeah.
That does happen, certainly. But that's sort of, I think, the part of relationships that's shifting so much. I remember I was speaking with J. Courtney Sullivan, who wrote a novel about marriage, and she was like, I think the reason that brides have to have so much pain and agony in getting their weddings together is there's no actual trauma to getting married anymore, that it's not going to actually change your life. You already live together. You already have your Tupperware containers. You don't need all these things. And yet, if we don't somehow inflict a trauma that can have some level of minor PTSD, we aren't convinced that something really happened and our lives changed. So we change our lives by inflicting horrible trauma of dealing with our entire families and a million napkins.
When you look at traditional societies, there are rituals, of becoming, an adult or whatever else that involves some kind of trauma, going on some kind of journey, something like a Rumspringa, whatever it is. And yeah, just the idea that you don't associate anything with weight and seriousness, unless there's some kind of trauma.
I know, it's the trauma of your wedding dress and your chevron straws and your placemats and things now.
Maureen, you recently wrote about the practice of Googling a date before you meet the person. Tell me a little bit about the choice.
So one of my girlfriends had met a guy and liked him, and she's like, I'm not gonna Google him. And I was like, what? And the key was that she's like, he mentioned his stand-up comedy. And I was like, what? Okay, come on, have you watched it? What is it? Is it good? And she's like, no, I'm not going to because I'm not Googling. And I was like, how do you not watch the guy's stand-up comedy on YouTube? That is the thing you must watch. And she was like, I don't want to. And I was like, you have to, I'm gonna make you. And I was looking at it and sending her a link, and I was like, this one isn't it. Or wait a few hours. And I was like, hey, look at this cute kitten. And it was his stand-up, and she's like, stop it. And she goes, I think not Googling a guy is the new abstinence, which was interesting. And then I started asking around, and I realized the number of people that were saying that they were trying to avoid certain types of social media or Googling engagement. And sometimes it was that they wouldn't want someone else to do that to them, or that they say, well, I have something embarrassing, so I do it out of the optimism that maybe the other person isn't. Or that there was almost I can't control myself once I see this information. Once I see his stand-up, I'm gonna judge him. And maybe if I knew him, if you know somebody, their corny jokes are just a charming piece of them.
Yeah.
But if you don't, you're sort of almost looking for deal breakers all the time. And I think that's also true when, say, you're looking at big, long OkCupid profiles or something, that you're looking for the one or two things that make you say no. When in fact, if you just sort of got to meet someone, so often you'd be okay with it. I remember when I was researching that, I spoke to a friend who's planning her wedding right now, and she's like, oh God, did I ever tell you that I made him show me his old OkCupid profile once? And I looked at it and I was just like, what a douchebag. I would never date that guy. There's a picture of him fake playing a guitar next to beer cans. She's like, that is the dorkiest thing I've seen in my life. But she's like, now I just get it, and it's just the way he is. He just doesn't get things like that, and it's adorable how clueless he is.
That's actually really, really interesting, because it does seem as though, let's say you go to the person's stand-up show without ever having seen it before, and then you're actually opening yourself up to the surprise of what it's going to be, or having the context. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Now, as a sex columnist, you also have given people some guidance and insight into how they should think about various dilemmas that emerge in the social media age, including what happens when you see someone in real life that you've encountered in the universe of dating smartphone apps. So what were some of the insights you found from your community?
It's interesting because I think to some degree the idea of online dating is something everyone does, because is there really that big of a functional difference between meeting someone on Tinder, seeing him at a party, whatever, or meeting a guy for 3 minutes at a party and then intensely Googling him and find him on Facebook and asking him on a date through a Facebook message, which, personally, that's what I do. So there was one time that there was somebody...
This is why people not being on Facebook, by the way, is actually moderately problematic. But,
this one guy I knew got divorced, and I was like, you just have to be on Facebook. And he's like, no. And I was like, okay, really? Because that guy just Facebooked me. That guy you're missing on everyone you could talk to, because nobody will ever find you again.
And also people want to process what your deal is. Yeah.
Everyone just assumes they'll be able to find you. You don't have to ask for anyone's number. Well, it's funny because when you sort of run it, even if you run into somebody you already know on, say, a Tinder or a Hinge or something, it flickers through your mind briefly, what would it be like to date them? What would it be like to sleep with them? And so even if you're going through and you're like, all of a sudden it sort of is in your head. And I think the number of people that have been like, well, I saw this person that I've known forever on Tinder, and then we did end up hooking up after a company party is alarming and amazing, because it sort of just reminds you to think of people as possibilities. There's one time that I went to a party, and I was just like talking. I was on a different date, and I was talking to some friends, and this guy just walks up and goes, "Maureen O'Connor, you bitch! You dropped our conversation on Tinder." And I was like, I have this like complete meltdown. I was like, I can't believe it. He broke the fourth wall. You're not supposed to talk about it out loud, and yet it also was. I just like had been busy or something and like missed out on whatever the Tinder conversation was, and then I did end up going on a date with him, and we had a fine time.
One critique that I've seen, and that's very, very clever. One critique that I've seen of just kind of generally how we interact with social media is this idea that social media has become a kind of job for millennials because there's this way in which you're kind of cultivating your self-presentation. So for example, Instagram is a thing where, yes, you're kind of like finding beautiful moments, but you're also kind of, for some, not everyone, but people who are like, let's say particularly savvy, you're kind of cultivating this idea of your brand, the kind of like I'm fun in these specific ways. Or when you think about like online dating in general, it's like related like with OkCupid, like, hey, my photos are all of me kind of, skiing in Chile. But what you're saying is that
Is that what your photos are?
They're not. But
What's your dating brand?
That's good. That's like this is something I've kind of thought about very deeply. But bracketing that,
I know because I've seen you on all the dating sites.
It's like, well, that's what I'm here for. What should we call it? But I think that it's just this way that like you're kind of because you're conveying limited information. So it's partly like it's kind of like. Here's how I consume, because that's a kind of shorthand for like, here's the kind of person I am, or kind of whatever else. And like, I kind of wonder, like, what do you make of that? Because like in real life, to some degree, it's like, well, it's not just your self-presentation, there's like more. And you discover like how thin the self-presentation is. So like, do you feel like that's something we kind of miss out on, or?
Yeah, I interviewed this woman, Judith Donath, once, and she's an academic, and she calls it a data self-portrait and data portraits, and she was saying that the internet sort of forces you to perpetually create your own self-portrait out of whatever evenness, and she looked back to like when it was message boards, just your signature would be a little bit of a self-representation, and that's sort of this sort of perpetual process of re-portraiting yourself, and you theoretically have different portraits for different places.
Right.
Which I like because it's a less repulsive term than brand, but basically it describes, I think, the same thing.
Well, it reminds me of the term personality was in the 18th century, allegedly, a term that was used for like a tiny number of people. Not everyone was a personality, not everyone had
everyone had one?
Well, but I think that, yeah.
Sometimes I feel like that, I'm like, really?
Okay, so one was
Am
a
I a
personality.
person?
Well,
Do I have a
but now, like,
personality?
actually, now a personality is a quality that we all have, right? I mean,
And everyone's beautiful too, so.
I don't know about that. But I mean, but it's just this idea, like this thing that was something that was kind of like a unique thing, and then it's a thing that we kind of all have, but like a brand too. Like, there's this idea historically that, okay, Errol Flynn had a brand, Cary Grant had a brand, you know what I mean? But then I suppose we all do now.
Well, I think it's just I think the reason that word is so gross is because it has the sort of just commercial element to it. And so like Cary Grant had a brand because he was a human that was like sold in some way.
Do you find it, do you find the idea gross, or do you kind of,
Yes.
but again, I guess interesting.
Yes, but the idea of a self-portrait doesn't gross me out. The idea of a personal brand, yes. Just like capitalist stigma or something, I don't know.
Thank you so much for sharing so much insight into millennial sex.
You're welcome.